couple of weeks before the start of the 1993 Formula One season, two men drove a hired yellow Ford van into the subterranean parking garage of the World Trade Center in Manhattan. The van contained a huge fertilizer bomb which exploded 12 minutes later, blowing a 100-foot, 30-meter wide hole through 4 levels of concrete, knocking out the World Trade Center's power, including the emergency lighting, and filling stairwells and lift shafts with thick, choking smoke. Although the bomb failed in its primary purpose of causing the North Tower to collapse into the South Tower, 6 people were killed, including a pregnant woman. Over 1,000 were injured, most during the evacuation, and most of New York City's radio and TV was put off the air for a while because their transmitters were on top of the towers and had had their power cut off. Investigations would later convict 4 men in 1994 of planning the attack, and in 1997 the 2 men in the van were convicted. One of them, the planner of the whole thing, wrote a letter to the New York Times after the attack, claiming to be a member of the 5th Battalion of the Liberation Army, and demanding that the US break off all diplomatic relations and material support for Israel and withdraw entirely from the Middle East. 2 days later, in Texas, agents of ATF, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco and Firearms, raided a compound in Waco, Texas, belonging to a cult called the Branch Davidians. Founded in 1955, the cult had long been known as a peaceful, if odd, splinter group of Seventh-day Adventism that awaited the coming apocalypse. In 1987, though, a leadership dispute had ended in a shootout, as Vernon Howell ousted founder Benjamin Roden and changed his name to David Koresh, and soon stories began emerging of him taking multiple brides, many underage, and ruling the cult with an iron fist. They were also suspected to be stockpiling weapons, which is what occasioned the ATF raid, but the cult were tipped off, and 4 agents and 6 Branch Davidians were killed. The ATF called in the FBI, who laid siege to the compound and began to negotiate with Koresh. Australia went to the polls, with Paul Keating's governing Labour Party predicted to lose to a coalition of the Liberal and National parties led by Liberal leader John Hewson. Despite the new Liberal economic policy package labelled Fight Back, which saw the party abandon their previous Keynesian policies in favour of an economically liberal direction, former Chancellor Keating was able to paint the proposed introduction of a goods and services tax by the coalition as a stealth tax on the middle classes, and won by a decent but not colossal majority of 80 seats to 65 in the House of Representatives, while losing control of the Senate. And across Grand Prix weekend, the east coast of North America was battered by a storm that became known variously as the Superstorm, the Great Blizzard, or the Storm of the Century. From Quebec to Honduras, high winds, storm surges and heavy snow saw 318 fatalities and $5.5 billion of damage caused, with Mount LeConte in Tennessee recording 56 inches, 140 centimetres of snowfall. For the first time, though, advances in weather forecasting had been able to accurately predict the storm and issue blizzard warnings, and indeed they were confident enough in the computer modelling to recommend states of emergency in several northeastern states, which undoubtedly saved many more lives. The South African Grand Prix was under something of a cloud too. The Kyalami circuit's owner, the MRE Group, had gone bankrupt, and while its former chairman, Dave McGregor, had found a buyer for the track, said buyer, Mervyn Key, was being prosecuted for embezzling government funds. Whether that was directly related to the 6.6 million rand he'd forked over for the circuit, I'm not sure. So, as the country of South Africa finally dragged itself out of the long era of apartheid and isolation, it looked like the return of the F1 circus might be short-lived after all. Bernie Ecclestone, for his part, appeared to be having second thoughts about some of the format changes announced before the season, and convened a meeting of the teams to announce that from Brazil onwards, the new schedule would be as follows. Free practice between 9:30 and 11 each morning, with 2 one-hour qualifying sessions from 1 till 2 p.m. on Friday and Saturday. However, while the sessions had been lengthened, drivers would be permitted a maximum of 23 laps in total for practice and 12 for qualifying. He also baffled reporters by seeming to wax nostalgic for the days when 2 or 3 drivers present at the start of the season would be dead by the end of it, allowing for a greater rotation of drivers. A week or so before the race, after having set the fastest lap of Silverstone of anyone over the winter testing, Ayrton Senna had pronounced himself happy enough with the MP48 to drive in South Africa, though he still had only committed for this one race and would see how he felt afterwards. Rumours were also that he and Ron Dennis were some $5 million apart in their fee negotiations. Senna remained openly critical of his Ford engine's lack of power compared to the unit in the Benetton car, to which Flavio Briatore remarked that he'd switched to elf fuel to counteract the effect of all of that tag electronic assistance McLaren had. The tag engineers, Osamu Goto and Udo Zucker, retorted that they'd only started developing on the 18th of December when the contract with Ford was signed. They didn't have the pneumatic distribution like the Benetton engine, and their active suspension was still only at 50% efficiency. Alain Prost was still sweating on his ability to race. The FISA tribunal had, as expected, admitted Williams to the championship and given him a super licence, but Max and Bernie were still playing good cop bad cop about his inflammatory statements, and Bernie was calling for a suspension, which would of course open up the title race nicely if Williams was as dominant as expected. Williams, for their part, were running on Friday with question marks on their nose and rear wing uprights, with the Sega deal announced on Saturday in a blaze of publicity, at which point the stickers were then applied to the cars and the drivers' helmets. March, meanwhile, were in deep trouble. The team personnel had arrived, but nothing else had. Having not paid Mario Ilion for the use of their Elmore engines in 1992, the containers had been blockaded by the bailiffs, and Messrs Lammers and Gounon had nothing to drive. Team co-owner Henry Vollenberg paid the no-show fine out of his own pocket, which prevented the team being ejected from the championship, and Jan Lammers contributed to paying for the engines, but at Kyalami at least there would be just 26 cars entering, and everyone would qualify. The new narrow tyres took a bit of getting used to, and there were plenty of off-track excursions in practice and qualifying, while the revised aerodynamic rules did seem to have slowed the cars a little and closed up the field. Prost was quickest on Friday, but Senna wasn't far off and nearly took an unexpected pole on Saturday until Prost threw everything at it and took the top spot, just 0.08 seconds ahead of the McLaren, for his first pole since France 1989. Schumacher put the Benetton third, though unhappy at being over a second and a half adrift, and would line up alongside Hill in his Williams debut, with the lazy fifth and Leto very impressive in the new Sauber sixth. Riccardo Patrese began his Benetton career in 7th, just ahead of Blundel's Ligier. Andretti's first F1 qualifying was marred by a gearbox failure and a few rookie errors, and he lined up 9th alongside the second Sauber of Wendlinger. Alliot was a creditable 11th on his return, Brundle 12th with an electrical fault on Saturday, the two young Brazilians on row 7, ahead of Berger, who had the new active suspension on his car while Alesi had the older version. The Loti could only manage 16th and 17th, suffering from oversteer, as did Ivan Capelli 18th, and at the back the rusty Barbazza, along with the Footworks and Tyrrells, both eagerly awaiting new cars, and the Lolas, who simply found no grip and had a serious gearbox problem to boot, ended up 6 and 9 seconds adrift of Prost, not helped by Badoer having Saturday's time scrubbed after getting a push start. New boy Rubens Barrichello cheerfully informed Riccardo Patrese that he'd been just 5 years old when Ricciardo made his F1 debut at Monaco in 1977. Patrese's reaction was unrecorded, while Jean Alesi had deflected attention from the shortcomings of his Ferrari by the simple expedient of having a buzz cut, which seemed to strike the world's media as much more interesting. The weather was hot, but also overcast and threatening a storm, as Prost prepared for his first Grand Prix start in 18 months, Badoer, Barbazza and Barrichello for their first ever, and Andretti for his first standing start as opposed to the rolling starts he was used to in IndyCar. Michael would incidentally become the first driver since Alain Prost in 1980 to make his F1 debut at the wheel of a McLaren. And so the cars lined up on the starting grid, not a single team with the same driver lineup as 1992, and all keen to impress. The lights went from red to green, and away they went. A minor clutch problem saw Prost drop back as Senna took the lead, chased by Hill, but only till turn 3, when Damon lost the back end and did a full 360 spin, getting going again in 12th, while Prost braked to avoid him and Schumacher got ahead. Meanwhile, no fewer than 3 cars had been left on the grid. Andretti stalled, Comas's clutch wasn't working properly, and De Cesaris's transmission broke. The first 2 were push-started by the marshals, but Tyrrell had the dubious honour of the first retirement of 1993. As the first lap ended, Senna was leading Schumacher with Prost third, then the 2 Saubers, Leto 4th and Wendlinger 5th, with the Alesi and the Ligiers giving chase. Not a bad start for the new team, and not a great one so far for the all-conquering Williams. Senna was pushing, opening out a 2-second gap to Schumacher, who closed it back up again as they lapped Comas already, and off-screen Ukio Katayama were pulled out with a gear selection issue, so a nightmare start to Tyrrell's season with both cars out by the end of lap 2. On lap 3, Ivan Capelli had an enormous off, going backwards into the tyres at the kink at some speed. A lot of rebuilding work for Eddie's boys, but Ivan was fine if a little shaken. Spots of rain started to fall around lap 5 as Senna and Schumacher had pulled out a gap of about 3 seconds to Prost, who now started to put his foot down and reel the leaders back in, setting a new fastest lap. Further back, Christian Fittipaldi's footrest got stuck under his brake pedal and sent him spinning, and as everyone braked to avoid him, Andretti wiped off his left front wheel on Warwick's footwork and trundled in to retire. A less than distinguished debut, but not really his fault. The stall on the grid turned out to have been a technical issue with the new McLaren fly-by-wire throttle. Leto was also in with an electronic problem on his gearbox that was going to need the engine cover off for a look. It was actually quite busy in the pits because Warwick was in too, to get new boots after he'd ended up with a flat tyre after his collision. As Prost continued pushing, Senna was encountering another electronic bug, his active suspension playing up and bouncing him around a bit, and the top three had closed right up, though only briefly as Prost, unable to pass Schumacher, decided to let the German go after Senna while he sat back and watched for a bit. Hill, for his part, was still down in 11th, having difficulty getting past Alio, who was in turn stuck behind Berger's lagging Ferrari. Wendlinger was brought in from 4th to serve a 10-second stop-go penalty for jumping the start and rejoined 8th, which promoted Alesi, still hounded by the Ligiers, now both running in the points. And on the same lap, Prost had closed up again and now passed Schumacher round the outside at turn 1. Score 1 for Renault power over the Ford V8, and now Prost was right up behind his old rival, the top three still running nose to tail and providing great racing, as the lighter, nimbler McLaren proved more useful on the tight, twisty circuit. In fact, Senna had dialed back the pace a bit, the three now 27 seconds ahead of Alesi and the Ligiers. Hill was punted out by an ambitious move by Zanardi at the West Bank hairpin, putting both out, as the leading group lapped Alboreto, with Prost still harrying Senna and Schumacher waiting to pick up the pieces if the two had another of their famous comings together. The Brazilian was having an increasingly hard time keeping the Williams behind him as his active suspension problems continued, and his tyres now also started to degrade. Badoa peeled into the pits for a look at his gearbox as the leaders bore down on him. Barbazza's race debut was ended after he was hit by Suzuki, who managed to go a little further before retiring himself, and just then Prost finally made his move stick, with Schumacher following through past Senna a few corners later. The McLaren's tyres were wrecked, and he and Schumacher came in at the end of lap 24 for new rubber. The McLaren pitwork was as good as usual and returned Senna to the track back in second place. The following lap, Prost was in, a decent but not spectacular stop and a slightly hesitant getaway almost costing him the lead, but Senna and Schumacher had both been held up by Alboreto, so battle was quickly rejoined. Brundle had also had a spin off camera from 6th and come in for new tyres and a nose, which put Riccardo Patrese up into the points in his Benetton debut, which became 5th as Blundell pitted too, as Alesi approached Warwick to lap him. Prost on his new tyres began to pull away from Senna and Schumacher now, who were continuing their lively scrap for second place, while Patrese had caught right up to Alesi and was looking like he was after that 4th place. Retirement number 10 was Philippe Alliot, who spun and stalled, so on lap 29 of the 72 the order was Prost leading Senna by about 4.5 seconds, with Schumacher right on his tail, then Alesi about 15 seconds behind the German, with Patrese a second behind him, and Blundell 6th, but now with a 20-second gap to the Patrese's Benetton. Behind Mark and just out of the points were Wendlinger, an impressive Barrichello, Fittipaldi, footrest problem presumably now sorted, and Herbert making up the top 10, with 9 different constructors represented among them. Alesi pitted the next lap, dropping behind Patrese but still well ahead of Blundell, but his Ferrari didn't go much further. He was back in on the next lap to retire, the hydraulic pump on his active suspension having come loose. His teammate Berger, running the other system, was at that moment being lapped by Prost, so it wasn't a happy weekend for Ferrari either. Senna was still having trouble keeping Schumacher behind him, wrestling with the handling problems of his McLaren, which had been marginally improved but not cured by the new tyres. Barrichello's debut ended after 31 laps with a gearbox failure, and Wendlinger's first race for Sauber 2 laps later with an engine failure. But both new driver and new team had had impressive debuts. But that was half the field down, with not quite half the race gone. It was starting to look like anyone who could reach the finish would do quite well, perhaps inevitable at the first race of the year with so much new equipment, and drivers new to either the sport or their team. As the midpoint came and went, the clouds were looking distinctly threatening, though those early drops of rain hadn't come to anything, and the Senna-Schumacher battle continued as Prost pulled further and further into the lead, now nearly 16 seconds. Johnny Herbert fell victim to the famous commentator's curse,
and 7 seconds behind Christopher Fittipaldi. In 7th place is Johnny Herbert, who's been quietly picking up places.
though this time it was James Hunt rather than Murray Walker who jinxed him, and on the following lap Schumacher had another go at Senna, who tipped him into a spin. Engine stalled, Schumacher was out, and Prix was up into an unexpected third place, despite, by his own admission, still not really knowing the car very well. Schumacher stalked off with a face like thunder, and there would be words later, no doubt. Behind Prix, as Senna came round to lap his old buddy Berger, who'd just been promoted to 6th, was Mark Blundell, just 6 seconds behind the Benetton, with Christian Fittipaldi now 5th. Prix had enough of a lead over Blundell to pit for tyres without losing 3rd, as Prost set about a trio of backmarkers in the shape of Alboreto, Warwick and Comas, the latter of whom was actually a lap behind the other two after his delayed start. Prost wasn't held up overly by the trio, but Comas was charging too, unlapping himself from Warwick but finding himself stuck behind Alboreto and giving him a bit of a fist wave as he eventually got through. Given the Lola's lack of speed, evidenced by its qualifying performance, Michele should be pretty happy with 8th place, even if it was only out of 11 now, though Warwick got past a couple of laps later. Still, at the rate things were going, a point on the new car's debut still wasn't impossible if he could just keep it running till the finish. Blundell had taken advantage of Prix's pit stop to close up and was charging, bearing down on the Benetton with a lapped Leto still going well just behind him. Benetton's 1992 record of scoring at every race, though, fell at the first hurdle as Prix got a wheel on the marbles on turn 5 on his new tyres and spun into the gravel. So Mark Blundell was up to 3rd now, with Fittipaldi 4th, Berger 5th and Martin Brundle back in the points in 6th, and Leto, still hanging on to Blundell's gearbox, then put up the fastest lap. Comas's Lamborghini had sprung an oil leak and was smoking and spreading oil on the track, but it wasn't until his pit called him in that he actually retired. With now just 9 cars left in the race, most of the actual racing had rather petered out as the race entered its final stages. Prost led Senna, the only two on the lead lap, then Blundell, Fittipaldi, Berger and Brundle in the points, and Warwick, Alboreto and Leto the only other cars running. With rain threatening again, Michele Alboreto peeled into the pits to retire on lap 59 of the 72, his engine temperatures rising. 8 left running. The following lap, Brundle spun on Comas's oil and stalled, ending his 100th Grand Prix rather ignominiously and promoting fellow British veteran Warwick into the points, with only Leto now running and not in a position to score. And then, on lap 62, it started to rain, but only in the pits and on the start-finish straight. The safety car, now instituted for every race after being trialled in 1992, was put on alert in case of an accident, while thought was given by the race stewards to red flagging the race if it came on to rain properly, now that enough of the race had been run to award full points anyway. Berger was another victim of Comas's oil, sliding across the grass but not losing his 5th place, as his team got ready with wets in case he needed them. Right now, though, as long as everyone was careful down the greasy straight, they could probably manage on slicks for the last 8 laps or so. Prost's lead, meanwhile, was so great by now, nearly 50 seconds over Senna, that he could either stop as a precaution or just ease right off and cruise to the finish. With 2 laps to go, the storm finally broke, with lightning splitting the sky as the rain started coming down in torrents. The remaining 7 drivers slowed right up, as Prost gingerly lapped Berger, whose engine was overheating, and he let Warwick unlap himself. Prost began his last lap, really tiptoeing around as lightning disrupted the TV picture. The Professor let Warwick and Leto through to unlap themselves as Berger's engine gave up on the very last lap. Leto and Warwick crossed the start line to begin their last lap as Prost came home to win the race. Senna brought his McLaren home 2nd, and Blundell was 3rd to take the first podium place of his career, and Ligier's first since Jacques Lafitte's 3rd place in the opening race of 1986. Following Senna across the line was a jubilant Christian Fittipaldi, tripling at a stroke his and his team's total points from 1992. Warwick, still racing Leto, aquaplaned off into the tyre wall, so in the end only 5 cars were actually still running at the end of the race, with JJ Leto taking 5th place to cap a pretty good debut by Sauber, and Berger taking the last point by dint of having gone a bit further than the desperately unlucky Warwick, who was the only man classified without having scored. Both Blundell and Leto had to be towed back to the pits after running out of fuel and spinning off, respectively, the circuit's complement of Land Rovers having a thorough workout at the end of the race, though Alliot got back in his LaRousse and was given a push start to get back under his own power. Ligier, Minardi and Sauber all celebrated as if they'd won, as well they might. F1 is not so difficult after all, said Peter Sauber, lighting a cigar. It had certainly been an incident-packed race, and while Prost's win was what everyone had expected, the performance of the McLaren had surprised everyone, and other teams would be having a look at those curious bodywork panels that had appeared between the front axle and side pods. Presumably these barge boards, as they were christened, were doing something useful to the aerodynamics. Ron Dennis would certainly hope that the result would strengthen his case to be given Ford engine parity with Benetton, and would hope that the success would ensure that at the very least Senna would agree to drive at his home Grand Prix in 2 weeks' time, though Ayrton refused to be drawn, saying it was still a matter of negotiating his fee. For Prost, though, his comeback win, the 45th of his long career, was tinged with apprehension as 4 days after the race he would appear before the FISA World Council with a possible suspension of his super licence if they found his remarks about FISA and FOCA during 1992 had harmed the image of the sport. Prost's defence was that at the time he'd made the comments he didn't hold a super licence, wasn't a competitor in the sport, and had been speaking as a private citizen and as a journalist for TF1. So, South Africa had seen an exciting battle between the old rivals Prost and Senna, but uncertainty still reigned, pun fully intended, about whether either would be present at the next race.